So Allan Hepburn is James McGill Professor of 20th Century Literature at McGill University, where he has taught for the past 21 years. He is the author of 3 monographs: Intrigue, Espionage and Culture, Enchanted Objects, Visual Art in Contemporary Literature, and A Grain of Faith, Religion in Mid-Century British Literature. He has published 40 essays on a wide variety of subjects and has edited 7 books, the most recent of which is Diplomacy and the Modern Novel, France, Britain, and the Mission of Literature, which was published just last year. He co-edits 2 book series, the Oxford Mid-Century series through Oxford University Press and the Mac Lennon Poetry series with McGill Queen's University Press. He's currently working on a book about statehood and citizenship in Britain between 1940 and 1960. One chapter of that book is about the temporality of states, atomic policy, and William Golding, which will be the subject of his talk today, since the talk is entitled Future and Past, Atomic Policy, Extinction, and the Inheritors. And I'm very excited about this because I actually taught a course on American poetry in the nuclear age. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Allan. Noëlle Cuny is doing us the pleasure to be a respondent for Allan today. She teaches translation and Anglo-American literature and culture at the University of Upper Alsace. She has recently edited Modernist Objects, about which we'll talk more at the end of this session, with Xavier Calque. After extensive work on the body in the novels of D.H. Lawrence and on discourse hybridity in modernist writing, she became interested in the material conditions of the literary canonization process, namely the magazines, first Lawrence's own Very Little magazine, then the later and more ambitious J.M. Murray Ventures, the Athenaeum in 1919-1921, and the early Adelphi. So, we are all ready to listen to you, Allan. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hélène. Thank you, Caroline, for organizing for today. And thank you to Noëlle for responding after the talk. I'm delighted to be with you this morning or this afternoon for you. As Hélène mentioned, this is a chapter of my next book, which deals with citizenship and statehood in 1940s and 1950s Britain. This will be the last chapter. It focuses on the temporality of the state. What is state time, I suppose, is how I might put that question, as well as the problems of nuclear extinction in the 1940s and 50s. And the central section of this talk will deal with British atomic policy. The talk is divided into 3 sections just for your forecast of what's to come: survival, extinction, and newness. And I will be addressing, especially in the first and third parts, the issues of modernism to some degree. William Golding's first novel, Lord of the Flies from 1954, is set in the catastrophic future during a nuclear war. His second novel, The Inheritors, from the following year, 1955, is set in the catastrophic past, at the evolutionary moment when Homo neanderthalensis is driven to extinction by Homo sapiens. The Inheritors, an extraordinary critique of the pursuit of human success at the expense of other species, poses the problem of imagining evolutionary time in novelistic form. Even the title provides a foreboding about what is received from the past and how it is transmitted to the future. Time in the novel exists prior to or outside political organization, except for elementary structures of kinship centered on clans and leaders. Golding did not believe that people improved over time from one generation to another, or from one epoch to the next. The remoteness of prehistory, deep time, if I may use Y.G. Dimmock's phrase to designate temporalities that lie beyond national configurations and defined periods, helps Golding clarify the relation between exercising intelligence and committing violent actions as an unchanging paradox in human society. Golding thought that novelists should concentrate on the basic human condition, not current affairs. In the sense that it deals with the universality of the human condition, The Inheritors projects prehistory as a double for post-war British society, in which the innate brutality of Homo sapiens counterpoints the authority vested in the state. Why should one species want to exterminate another for no good reason? In the post-war context, why should one nation wish to obliterate another with nuclear weapons? An amateur archaeologist who read everything that he could find about Neanderthals in order to write The Inheritors, Golding understands human societies in terms of willful annihilation. One species exerts its sovereignty by forcing other species into extinction, in part through warfare and in part through the introduction of newness into the world. In Golding's novels, survival and extinction are male prerogatives. In Lord of the Flies, Jack leads a military faction of boys who build a redoubt, smear their bodies with clay, murder Piggy, and try to hunt Ralph to extinction. Ralph survives only because a naval officer appears in the nick of time and calls a halt to the boys' war games. In Pincher Martin, Golding's third novel from 1956, a man hoists himself out of the sea up a rock face after his ship capsizes. As he searches for food and shelter, he concentrates all his will on the fight to survive. He thinks about writing SOS with seaweed and builds a human effigy out of stones to attract the attention of passing ships. Quote, "Plenty to do on a rock, never a dull moment," unquote, Pincher says, as if he were a character in one of Samuel Beckett's plays. Pincher Martin ends with a narrative trick. Pincher, who serves in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve during an unspecified war, but which we can presume to be the Second World War, has not survived at all. He has been dead all along, and the narrative is nothing more than his afterlife in words, a manifestation of his determination to survive in spirit, if not in flesh. Quote, "Would you say there was any surviving?" unquote, asks the officer who picks up Pincher's corpse, with reference to whether he suffered before he died and whether souls survive beyond physical death. In Freefall, Golding's next novel from 1959, a painter thinks about survival in terms of Darwinian evolution and its exemption from morality. Philip, we are told, is a living example of natural selection. He was as fitted to survive in this modern world as a tapeworm in an intestine. In this biological model, livingness is the barest sign of survival, more continuance than existence. For Golding, survival as instinctive clinging to life is similar to, but nonetheless distinct from, existential survival, in which human interdependence confers meaning and pattern. In Freefall, survival shades into the mid-century concern with the definition of man in all its social complexity. Quote, "When a man cries out instinctively, he begins to search for a place where help may be found," unquote. In other words, the cry for help is the expression of the instinct to survive, and that survival takes place within a human community. In The Inheritors, Golding imagines extinction and survival as instances of speciesism, namely the exploitation of other species on the premise that humankind is superior to all others. A clan of Neanderthals, most of them bearing monosyllabic names, Ha, Lok, Fa, Nil, Mal, and the two-syllable children Oa and Liku, communicate through mime, thought pictures, and rudimentary speech. As the novel opens, the clan is migrating from its wintering place near the sea to its summering place on a terrace in the uplands. At the same time, a migratory group of Cro-Magnon Homo sapiens, led by a wizard named Marlin, crosses the Neanderthals' path. The Homo sapiens treat the Neanderthals as inimical, even demonic. Fearful and aggressive in equal measures, the Homo sapiens reject coexistence with other species. In acts of motiveless violence, they slay Nil, abduct Liku and Oa, pursue Fa, and shoot arrows at Locke. When Locke tries to hail the strangers, they hear his friendly greeting as a war cry. All contact between Neanderthals and human beings, called respectively the people and the new people, begins in violence and leads to death. Summing up this contact, Fa points to a slug smeared into the ground. They have gone over us like a hollow log. They are like a winter. As her metaphor suggests, the new people assert their superiority as a biological fact. As a slug, Fa does not rise to the presumed stature of the new people. Yet the new people blight and destroy all they touch, like the winter. Their superiority is a form of death. Whereas the Neanderthals think and behave communally, the new people use their intelligence to connive, plot, usurp, and murder. Tuomi, an artist and schemer, sharpens an ivory blade with the intention of stabbing Marlin and taking over as leader. Because the new people look upon the red-skinned Neanderthals as a distinct and separate species, they justify massacring them as self-defense. In an act of wanton cruelty, the new people, who have alcohol but no food, slaughter, roast, and eat Liku. Because she is humanoid but not human in their eyes, she is deemed edible. Hélène, could you change the slide, put up the map? In The Inheritors, which Golding considered his best novel, and I agree with that judgment, I think it is his finest novel by far, survival measures units of time. Species emerge, roam the earth, expire. Their survival has duration and scale. They may spread over continents and last for millennia, or they may be short-lived and move within a specific region or locale. By approaching the modernist problem of temporality through the survival and duration of species, Golding thinks of time, both past and future, in planetary terms. So does H.G. Wells in The Outline of History, being a plain history of life and mankind from 1920, a book that ran through several editions and sold at least 2 million copies in the 1920s and 1930s. Wells's The Outline of History is not a chronicle of wars, regimes, and empires, but a primer about life on Earth as a universal history. Wells's panoramic history includes the effect of climate and glaciation on life forms, the rise and fall of oceans, the evolution and demise of species. And the slide is of the map of the territory of Neanderthals that I have taken from The Outline of History. Hélène, could you give us the next slide? With modernist skepticism about the place of man in the universe, Wells compares the sun in the past with the sun in the future. Hélène, can you give us the text, the next one? Number 3 there. No, it's not working. Okay, so here's the text. This is.
I'm going to just exit the. Caroline asked me to make it larger for you, but it's not working. I'm going back to the previous setup.
Okay. So while you're doing that, I'll just read it. This is from Wells, The Outline of History. There was a time when the day was not a half and not a third of what it is today, when a blazing hot sun, much greater than it is now, must have moved visibly, had there been an eye to mark it from its rise to its setting across the skies. There will be a time when a day is as long as a year is now, and the cooling sun, shorn of its beams, will hang motionless in the heavens. Just a quick pause. There was a time, everybody will hear the beginning of Wordsworth's Ode on the Intimations of Immortality. There was a time when every meadow, field, and stream, Wells, I think, is quite consciously echoing that romantic poem. In the past, no eye watched the blazing sun. In the future, no eye will look upon the dying sun. Consciousness confers temporality by measuring and comparing it to what has come before and what will come after. Wells's modernist technique of widening the scale of time resonates with Wyndham Lewis's Time and Western Man from 1927, an attack on the time cult, as Lewis called it, and Virginia Woolf's experiments with temporality in Mrs. Dalloway, The Waves, and other novels. In between the acts, you will remember, from 1941, Lucy Swithin is reading a book about the history of the planet. She does not provide its title, but it is usually assumed to be Wells's The Outline of History, and that book stokes her fantasies about ancient beasts stamping in mud and giant ferns growing in Piccadilly. Hélène, the next slide, please. Golding, too, read The Outline of History and cites a passage from it as an epigraph to The Inheritors. So I've given you the page from Wells's book, and there's some minor adjustments that Golding made when he quoted from this. In the quoted passage, Wells comments on the extreme hairiness, ugliness, and repulsive strangeness of Neanderthals' appearance. According to John Carey, Golding's biographer, Golding found this statement uproariously funny, presumably because he disagreed with Wells's commitment to a progressive view of history, and because he doubted that humankind in its present form was the acme of evolutionary biology. Golding emphatically did not think that human beings progressed, whether through evolution or actions or industriousness. Understood in light of Golding's ironic quotation, the epigraph from The Outline of History refers to speciesism and the new people's repudiation of the people. According to Wells, the two species did not intermix, nor did they interbreed, which Golding denies in The Inheritors, insofar as the infant Oa is carried away by and integrated into the Homo sapiens tribe. As I'm sure you know, science bears out Golding's assumption and refutes what Wells believed. In fact, we now know that the human genome contains about 3 to 4% of Neanderthal genetic material. Irony aside, Golding found much to use, if not admire, in Wells's The Outline of History, in a chapter entitled The Neanderthal Men, an Extinct Race. Wells draws upon archaeologists' expertise to describe Neanderthal weapons, hunting techniques, tribal organization, burial rites, leadership, control of fire, and brain size. Almost all this material is repurposed and enlarged in The Inheritors. In passing, Wells mentions that Neanderthal capacity for language was probably limited. Quote, "It may be they did not speak at all or very sparingly. They had nothing we should call a language." Golding exploits this point. Neanderthals, as he represents them, communicate by thought pictures more than by words. They share emotion by feeling it, then projecting it towards each other as a form of telepathy. In the same fashion, they communicate stories and ideas. In this regard, language has a vexed relation to feeling and consciousness, as it does in Women in Love, Ulysses, Mrs. Dalloway, Finnegan's Wake, and other high modernist works. What is known or felt is not necessarily communicable. Certain forms of consciousness are not primarily verbal, but visual or narrative. In The Inheritors, not having language is not a sign of stupidity, but a sign of empathy, certainly among Neanderthals. The new people have no capacity to share thought pictures. They may be a thinking species with language and consciousness, but they are warlike, cruel, and competitive. In this sense, evolution signifies a change or adaptation, not necessarily an improvement. Moreover, by making the new people antipathetic and by representing them mostly from the point of view of the Neanderthals, at least until the last two chapters, Golding challenges the meaning of novelistic character. Need characters in novels be human beings? And is the mastery of language crucial or incidental to the definition of character? Not having language certainly sets limits to abstract thought for the Neanderthals. When Locke swings over the water on a branch and sees his own reflection, he fears it. He has no way of looking objectively at himself, or not for very long. He thinks about inside Locke and outside Locke. Quote, he experienced Locke upside down over deep water with a twig to save him, unquote. And in the depths of the water, which the Neanderthals fear, he sees his mother rolled over by the current, specks of dirt moving in and out of her mouth, her eyes sightless and dead. Without language to describe the unknown, the Neanderthals defamiliarize objects and social interactions, especially when confronted with the new and strange. By assuming a Neanderthal point of view, which is proto-linguistic and mostly visual, Golding defamiliarizes narrative. How does one tell a story from a non-human point of view? In the outline of history, Wells praises the Neanderthals' ability to learn. He says, before extinction overtook them, even the Neanderthalers learnt much and went far, unquote. In the Inheritors, Golding assesses what is learned and what is lost when one species forces another into extinction. I'm going to turn now to part 2, which is about extinction and atomic policy. After 1945, extinction was on everyone's mind because of the devastation wrought during the Second World War and because of the annihilating power of nuclear weapons. Extinction was a philosophical challenge as much as it was an assessment of political risk. In Civilization on Trial, a collection of essays and speeches published in 1948, Arnold Toynbee reflects on the extinction of civilizations: Sumeria, Macedonia, ancient Greece, the Roman Empire. For Toynbee, collaboration among nations offers a possible antidote to the extinction of contemporary civilization. World society, he declares, is not a wish fulfillment to be realized in the future, but a present and pressing concern. Since approximately 1500 of the Common Era, Toynbee argues, mankind has been gathered into a single world society as a consequence of human migration and encounters among disparate populations. In Civilization on Trial, a short essay that gives its name to the whole book, Toynbee forecasts the future based on one of two assumptions. The first assumption entails survival of the human species. He states, the future of mankind may not, after all, be going to be catastrophic, and we shall survive the rest of this batch of world wars as we survived the first two bouts. Alternatively, the two world wars have been, as he says, mere overtures to some supreme catastrophe that we are going to bring on ourselves. In an extraordinary calculation of the odds of survival, Toynbee wagers that Tibetans and Eskimos, that's his word, not mine, who previously had the advantage of being well beyond zones of conflict, are likely to be implicated in future world wars. In this reckoning, no place on Earth is sufficiently remote to guarantee survival. If any population is to endure, he predicts, it will be the Negrito Pygmies of Central Africa, presumably on the grounds that nuclear wars will not target that region. Toynbee, however, leaves this hypothesis unsubstantiated, as he does most of his prophecies. In most nuclear fiction of the 1940s and 1950s, such as Aldous Huxley's Ape and Essence, John Wyndham's The Chrysalids, Neville Shute's On the Beach, and Golding's Lord of the Flies, all of which concern nuclear war and its fallout, the remoter parts of the planet, particularly New Zealand, Australia, and Labrador, are safer than the US or Europe, but far from risk-free when it comes to the possibilities of extinction. Toynbee concludes Civilization on Trial with a shrug. There has been life on Earth for 500 to 800 million years, but man established his ascendancy only in the past 100,000 years. Giant armored reptiles and fish both had much longer reigns than humankind and perished all the same. If the ants, this is Toynbee, if the ants and bees were one day to acquire even that glimmer of intellectual understanding that man has possessed in his day, Toynbee states, and if they were then to make their own shot at seeing history in perspective, they might see the advent of the mammals and the brief reign of the human mammal as almost irrelevant episodes, unquote. Toynbee means that human history is irrelevant to planetary time, which confirms geologists' and Darwinians' line of thought, but hardly qualifies as news. He also means that the temporality of statehood itself is an illusion because the state reckons with time by excluding it along with the possibility of extinction, an end of time that cannot be admitted, let alone calculated in terms of the rise, success, and extinction of states. Over the dangers and likely outcomes of nuclear war, scientists and humanists were deeply divided in the 1940s and 1950s. Indeed, nuclear technologies provoked a backlash against scientists who dared to take life and death into their own hands by mastering atomic fission. Whereas scientists offered vague reassurances about risk, humanists imagined doomsday scenarios and advocated prudence, if not reversal, of nuclear policies. The campaign for nuclear disarmament was founded in the UK in 1957, with J.B. Priestley's article, Britain and the Nuclear Bomb from that year, and Bertrand Russell's Common Sense and Nuclear Warfare from 1959, both arguing for de-escalation of tensions and reduction of stockpiled armaments. Meanwhile, scientists and military strategists calculated the odds of survival and what survival might entail for governments, states, and individuals. For some experts, the threat of extinction meant the death of the planet due to nuclear war and radioactive fallout. For others, extinction meant the obliteration of populations in whole or in part, as when Herman Kahn, a military strategist and game theorist at the Rand Corporation, estimated that 10 to 60 million Americans would die if there were a war with the USSR. In his blandly statistical book on thermonuclear war from 1960, Kahn calculates the risks and kinds of war, the economic losses, and the percentage of birth defects over coming generations if nuclear weapons are launched on a large scale. We must also take seriously the problem of alleviating the conflict by arms control and international agreement, Kahn concedes, before concluding that the survival of our civilization may depend on our making this effort. Although histories of the Cold War tend to focus on the US and the USSR, I want to contextualize questions of mid-century extinction and survival in British politics and culture, which take a slightly different course from those of the two superpowers. Nuclear policy certainly transformed the British state, its infrastructure, its international presence, its military ambitions, its temporalities. In August 1945, Clement Attlee circulated a 3-page memorandum called The Atomic Bomb, the first paper he drafted as Prime Minister, among members of the newly established Atomic Energy Cabinet Committee. He measured the consequences of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki against the future of the British state. Atomic bombs, he declared, rendered much of our post-war planning out of date. This is in 1945, he says that. There is no point in locating munitions plants somewhere else, Attlee concluded, because bombs can reach long-range targets, including London, which in his view had to be protected at all costs as the center of the empire. Like most informed people in 1945, Attlee rightly saw that the atomic bomb rendered other weapons obsolete. In God and the Atom from 1945, Ronald Knox, weighing the spiritual cost of splitting the atom for military ends, acknowledges that the atomic bomb is, as he says, a foretaste of the weapons the next war will be fought with, though he continues to hope against hope that the bomb will make war impossible in future. Knox means that the possibility of widespread devastation or the prospect of forcing human species into extinction ought to deter any nation from engaging in nuclear warfare. In the essay called You and the Atom Bomb, also from 1945, George Orwell points out that the history of civilization is in fact a history of weapons. Quote, every development in military technique has favored the state as against the individual, and the industrialized country as against the backward one, unquote. Whereas insurrections and revolutions once were fought with rifles, Orwell points out, wars are now fought with impersonal atomic bombs. Instead of democratizing, weapons consolidate state authority to the point that they appear unconquerable. By this logic, the nuclear arms race signifies a global triumph of statism and a corresponding diminution of democracy. Hélène, could you put up the next slide? The next slide is a cartoon I found in Punch not that long ago of the Home Secretary, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, tackling civil defense problems. As you can see in the comic mode of Punch, he has an H-bomb in his inbox on his desk and a little pail, presumably of sand or something to put out the blast afterwards. Just as an example of some of the more lighthearted thinking about nuclear weapons in this case in 1954. Until August 1949, when Russia tested an atomic device in Kazakhstan, Britain, like the US, believed it had an advantage in the arms race. Both the US and the UK intended to maximize that advantage in order to build bigger bombs that could annihilate populations more efficiently. On 3 October 1952, Britain tested an atomic bomb off the coast of Australia. Just a month later, on the 1st of November 1952, the US tested a hydrogen bomb on Inuit Atoll in the South Pacific. In Britain, successive governments under Prime Ministers Attlee, Churchill, Eden, and Macmillan understood nuclear capacity as a way to assert international prestige, particularly as a mediating third force between the US and the USSR, which is how Britain tried to position itself in the nuclear arms race, especially in the 1950s and the early 1960s, as a third force, as a mediating force. The arms race generated endless calculations pertaining to tonnage, death, devastation, and possibilities of survival. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima had the impact of 15 kilotons of TNT. Orange Herald, detonated in the South Pacific by the UK on the 31st of May 1957, yielded 720 kilotons of energy. The obsessive assessment of weapon size and impact, which amounts to a mathematization of destruction, became a quasi-scientific shorthand for events that boggle the imagination. In November 1949, Lord Trenchard estimated that an atomic attack would kill 10 to 20 million Britons in a month. After the nuclear test at Inuit, Churchill conjectured that 4 or 5 H-bombs would kill about 1 million British people, and radioactive clouds miles wide would, as he said, drift over the land attacked and extinguish human life over very large areas. A little reticence for once on Churchill's part about giving exact figures beyond a few million. Calculations of danger usually conceal hidden fears about safety and survival. How many feet below ground might put one out of harm's way? How long does radioactivity last? What are the odds of living at the epicenter of a blast or at various distances from ground zero? Stimulated by speculations about what effects 10 megaton Soviet hydrogen bombs would have were they dropped on the UK, plans went ahead to install a top-secret underground bunker, codenamed Stockwell, on the Wiltshire-Somerset border in the late 1950s. Predictions of nuclear disaster in the 40s and 50s were as common as weather forecasts. Virtually everyone expected atomic war sooner or later. For example, with anarchic zeal, Arthur Seaton, the protagonist in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning from 1958, looks forward to a general smash-up. He figures that these days a war could start tomorrow, although his Uncle George thinks the next world war might start in 3 months. In Look Back in Anger, John Osborne's play from 1956, nuclear catastrophe is not tragic, but ignominious. Quote, "If the Big Bang does come and we all get killed off, it won't be in aid of the old-fashioned grand design. It'll just be for the brave new, nothing very much, thank you, about as pointless and inglorious as stepping in front of a bus," with the intentional insinuation of suicide that Osborne is hinting at in The Arms Race as a suicidal mission. Between 1945 and 1960, British novelists returned time and again to the issue of extinction in relation to statehood. In general, mid-century novelists reject the idea of a collaborative world state, such as Toynbee champions, in favor of hypothetical states that have narrowly survived extinction, usually brought about by nuclear annihilation. These novels almost always take place in the future, whether near or deep. In John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids from 1951, genetically modified three-legged plants threaten the continued existence of human beings. The Triffids have basic intelligence, weaponized stems, primitive communication, in addition to sheer numbers that could wipe out human populations around the world, beginning in the UK. In Neville Shute's On the Beach, radioactive particles drifting towards Australia after a nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere carry the inevitability of human extinction, thus ending the need for any state whatsoever. I'd just like to point out that On the Beach was instrumental in the helping to form the campaign for nuclear disarmament after people saw this incredibly depressing and dire movie about the extinction of the worldwide population of human beings, not to mention all other life forms. People started to organize a little bit more militantly, and this was aided by the film production of On the Beach as well, but the novel itself kicked off this momentum. In another example of this kind of catastrophic thinking, Muriel Spark reverses the futuristic and nuclear tropes of catastrophe novels by setting her novel Robinson from 1958 on an island in 1954, and by making a plane crash the instigating event of the plot, not a nuclear bomb. At the end of Spark's novel, in a variation on the motif of extinction, the island sinks beneath the ocean. Once the man-shaped island becomes a figment of the past rather than a place on a map, all things are possible, as January, the narrator, comments in the last sentence. In post-war nuclear discourse, atomic capacity accelerates temporality. Events speed up as they rush toward catastrophe. Bombs ticking along in the background of post-war British culture make everyone think anxiously of countdowns that end in annihilation. In the film 7 Days to Noon from 1950, a scientist threatens to detonate a nuclear device in central London unless the government stops stockpiling weapons. The title of the film is itself a countdown, 7 Days to Noon. The Inheritors, On the Beach, and Robinson are all countdown novels. They measure time as a shrinking quantity as they move towards the non-time when species are extinguished. In Shute's novel, whose 9 chapters count out the 9 months between December and September, as if the temporality of the narrative were a gestational cycle, the people in Melbourne, in Australia, count the shrinking months, weeks, then days until their predictable deaths. They die in their beds, they die in their cars, they die in their boats and submarines. Everyone dies from radiation sickness. There are no survivors. In Spark's novel, January, whose name is a unit of time, counts down the days until a Portuguese ship arrives on the isolated island to rescue her and the other survivors. In this case, The countdown ends with a return to normal temporality, during which January writes up her experience retrospectively. In this instance, first-person narration is a badge of survival. My last section is about newness and the Inheritors. In the Inheritors, Golding reflects on the meaning of newness and the way it comes into the world. He does not endorse the modernist commitment to newness for its own sake, whether in technology, modes of communication, or modes of representation. Newness brings change that inflicts death and the disappearance of species. In this regard, Golding offers his most searching critique of modernity as a commitment to rationality and progress. Locke imitates the way the new people walk and foolishly thinks, I am one of the new people. He's kind of drunk when he says that, but nonetheless, he sees himself as taking on the behavior of the new people. Whether he changes or not, the new people will never accept him. The Neanderthals lack inventiveness. They cannot conceive of anything that does not already exist. Fa, who is by far the most intelligent member of the clan, pictures a dipper to carry water, like the shells that they use at the seashore, but neither Locke nor Liku can make out what she means. That is a new thing, they think, and therefore dismiss it. They cannot understand why a dipper might be useful for fetching water on the upland terrace where they spend the summer months. A dipper belongs to the seaside, and only there. Before the arrival of the new people, the Neanderthals accept unchanging temporality as a fact. Quote, today is like yesterday and tomorrow. So there's no differentiation between days. There are seasons, but time is not subdivided. None of the Neanderthals thinks of laying up provisions against scarcity. They harvest honey and grubs according to their hunger, not according to their future needs, although they do store some venison at the back of their cave. They live in a present regulated by seasons and instinct. The arrival of the Cro-Magnon people, by contrast, ushers in a day of total newness. Being unable to adapt to newness, the Neanderthal clan has no defenses against the destruction perpetrated by the Homo sapiens. They have trouble conceiving that another species even exists. How could Ha meet another? Locke chatters at Fa. There is no other in the world. Locke's refusal to imagine another species similar to the Neanderthals, but nonetheless divergent, is not a liability in and of itself, yet it becomes one when the other, armed with bows, arrows, whips, and murderous intentions, decides to eradicate the Neanderthal people. From one perspective, newness is understood to be an evolutionary advantage. The most unexpected trait of the Homo sapiens as a species is their ability to project abstract situations as representations, a form of externalization that the Neanderthals do not share and cannot fathom. Whereas the people, the Neanderthals, carry pictures in their heads, the new people draw pictures on rocks or venerate a stag as a religious totem. As a projection of their fear, the new people, or more specifically Tuami, the artist, draws a picture of the diabolical Neanderthals being speared by the omnipotent stag. When Locke and Fa look at this representation, they do not grasp its meaning, despite the fact that Locke is its subject. Hélène, could you put up the text, the next slide? As when he sees his own face reflected in the water, he cannot imagine himself objectively, or with very limited means of looking at himself objectively, let alone as a representation. Quote, the face was red, with enormous spreading arms and legs, and the face glared up at him, for the eyes were white pebbles. The hair stood out round the head, as though the figure were in the act of some frantic cruelty, and through the figure, pinning it to the stag, was a stake driven deep, its ends split and furred over. The two people retreated from it in awe, for they had never seen anything like it. Although the red figure recalls the redness of Locke's skin, the representation distorts Locke by casting him as cruel and violent, when he is, among his own clan, sympathetic and generous. He tracks down food, and he cares for others when they are ill or injured. The representation of Locke is a projection of the new people's fear and their cruelty, even as it enacts a fantasy of revenge. In what they imagine to be an offering that will appease the fiendish Neanderthals, the new people smear another red figure on a rock, again with hair sticking up and pebbles for eyes, and again with a stick driven into the creature's side. In the second image, however, there is a strip of hide fastened to the stick, and to that stick is tethered a sacrificial victim, a young girl named Tanakil. The representation moves between emotion, fear and cruelty, and religion, sacrifice and appeasement. Speaking about the ability to create effigies and representations, Golding points out that the new people have, quote, invented something which simply isn't there, but they have to make a picture of it and give it offerings, unquote. In this regard, their abstracting of situations into representations is one way of objectifying in order to dominate so-called enemies. While that capacity for representation may be seen as an evolutionary advance, it is not superior to the images that the people carry in their heads. Indeed, the new people's ability to make violent images precedes actual violence. The new people, feeling threatened by what they do not understand and cannot control, force the people into extinction. The novel counts down time by recording the death of all the Neanderthals except Locke. In turn, Mal, Ha, Nil, and the old woman, then Liku and Fa, die because of the Cro-Magnon people, either directly or indirectly. Utterly alone, Locke lopes along the terrace where the fire has gone out. Although the novel focalizes events principally through Locke, in the penultimate chapter, as if colluding with the new people's aggression, the narrative objectifies him. Whereas the narrator has treated Locke as a clown who likes to make others laugh by pantomiming actions, the modernist technique of defamiliarization that predominates in the novel is suddenly turned against him. He is the feared, the unknown, the abandoned, and the unsympathetic. Hélène, could you put up the next slide, which is a little bit of text about Locke being treated in the third person as an it. No longer called Locke, he becomes the red creature, or it. It pulled its legs up, knees against the chest. It folded its hands under its cheek and lay still. It made no noise, but seemed to be growing into the earth. In effect, the narrative anthropologizes Locke. He is the last surviving Neanderthal, a species that had lived for tens of thousands of years upon the earth, until the Neanderthal and human genome diverged about 500,000 years ago, before the Neanderthal species died out altogether 40,000 years ago. Whereas extinction usually occurs over a span of time, Golding, for narrative purposes, dramatizes the extinction of the Neanderthals as fast and irreversible. Like Mal, who was buried with his ancestors on the terrace, Locke grows into the earth, not as a character, but as an artifact, to be restituted or excavated as an example of how extinction results from too much goodness in one species and too much malignity in another. To conclude, on 15 July 1960, the lead article in the Times Literary Supplement speculated on the constraints imposed on the writer's imagination by science, technology, and the state. The TLS decided to organize a little symposium about these issues of how does a writer respond to changes in technology and science and the state. And here was the challenge that the TLS posed. In the age of technological sovereignty and perfected controls of the mind in which we now live, the artist lies under some Damoclean threat to his very existence. Can he continue to function as a source of fresh images of life? So that was the question that the TLS authors posed. In response to this question, 9 men, including Arnold Toynbee, and 1 woman, Nathalie Sarraute, submitted short essays on the limits of control over literature to an omnium gatherum called The Writer's Dilemma. William Golding's contribution, called On the Crest of the Wave, is an impassioned defense of the humanities. Golding writes, "Our humanity rests in the capacity to make value judgments, unscientific assessments, the power to decide that this is right, that wrong, this ugly, that beautiful, this just, that unjust." Because the human spirit is wider and more complex than the whole of the physical evolutionary system, as Golding puts it, the future remains, as far as writing goes, unpredictable, open to spontaneity, genius, and novelty. Be that as it may, the Inheritors charts the limitations of the evolutionary system. Competition between species, notably human beings against other life forms, prepares the way for extinction. As Norman Cousins wondered in the 1945 book called Modern Man is Obsolete, how much time does mankind have left, as Cousins puts it, before he employs the means now available for the ultimate in self-destruction, extinction? In the Inheritors, the clock is already counting down. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allan. Your conclusion leaves me a little bit speechless, but it's not a bad thing because Noëlle is going to address us and I will have time to recover. So, Noëlle, this is your time.
Oh, I'm not the bringer of good news here. I'm sorry. I wish. Listening to you, Professor Hepburn, today and reminiscing about certain wartime pieces of poetry or fiction I read over the years, I see that you are right. And I am tempted to venture some generalizations. Narratives of extinction and survival indeed tend to accelerate time, as if postulating impending extinction led writers to conflate cause and effect to a point of concentration where the least decision changes the course of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Ted Hughes's 1986 account of Golding's The Inheritors revolves around a parallel between the novel and the work of one South African zoologist around the time of the Boer War. The zoologist, who was working on baboons, identified a subgroup of clever baboons, observed that the cleverer baboons put themselves more at risk, and leapt to similar conclusions regarding humans, despairing over the awful evolutionary dead end that is conscious intelligence in Homo sapiens. Much later, in The Empire of the Atom, the 1956 science fiction bestseller by the American A.E. von Vogt, one finds similar conflations: compressed time, compressed cause and effect, friction between competing humanoid species who had never previously had to share the same space before. Thinking in terms of extinction produces interesting time and space distortions. Herbert Reed or Wells or Huxley would have felt at home with both of these thought adventures, I feel. As regards modernism itself, I do see in what parts of modernism one encounters effects such as the thinking in leaps or the speeding up of time, notwithstanding other aspects of modernist time, such as Bergsonian duration or Nietzschean ewige Wiederkehr. I'm actually much more comfortable myself discussing vorticism or risk-taking in periodical writing than I am discussing Cold War extinction narratives, be they mind-blowing and indeed beautiful, like William Golding's The Inheritors. Come to think of it, perhaps the one thing that gives me any legitimacy discussing tales of nuclear extinction is the whole 2 hours I spent over 20 years ago at the Los Alamos Science Museum in New Mexico, looking at replicas of American A-bombs, discovering pop culture avatars of atomic man, such as Astro Boy or Sonic the Hedgehog, and reading Einstein's extraordinary letter to Roosevelt, insisting that the USA catch up with Germany's military nuclear program, and develop what was to become the Manhattan Project in order to restore the balance of powers. Therein, I think, lies my only legitimacy. Or else, I was trusted with the task of responding to Professor Hepburn's fascinating paper on the Inheritors because I am myself part Neanderthal. But aren't we all, Allan reminded us that nowadays we do know for sure that we all are part Neanderthal. Even sub-Saharan Africans, apparently. That's the latest. So, you're right. Those two species did not actually, one did not entirely kill off the other. There was merging. Yes. But let me go back to D.H. Lawrence, since I was kindly encouraged to do so by our distinguished speaker prior to today's meeting. In the years leading up to the First World War, Lawrence too had been particularly interested in geological time and evolutionary biology. In geological time, worlds appear and disappear, expand and contract, thrive and then dwindle. This is something Lawrence learned not from the Home University Library of Modern Knowledge or from Tate's late Victorian classic The Unseen Universe, exposed though he was to those famous popularizers, but from the pre-Socratic poet Empedocles. In Empedocles, the cosmos is a cyclical occurrence. It is an alternation of creative and destructive phases, the important thing being to accept that the destructive phase will reach its endpoint no matter what you do. Perhaps you know certain examples of this continuing tradition. Names come to mind, perhaps Gian Battista Vico or William Butler Yeats, but there are many more examples in pop culture. I only have one example here, but it is a telling one. David Seed, in his 2013 book on the atomic bomb and Cold War narratives, gives Robert Cromie's 1895 science fiction novel, The Crack of Doom, as the first description of an atomic explosion. David Seed goes on to paraphrase the logic of Robert Cromie's terrorist protagonist in terms that are evocative of a strange, archaic, frankly anti-humanist, but not at all rare strain of thought at the turn of the century. I quote from David Seed. Strife is a principle of nature since it is the way life itself emerges. And the bomber's fantastic dream is of merging humanity back into the matrix of protoplasm. This nirvana, as he calls it, therefore represents a kind of atomic mysticism where he doesn't see himself as killing, only returning humanity to the life pool of the universe. So I found this obviously very radical and fascinating at once, and also as a reader of Empedocles, I couldn't help but notice that strife is a key notion in Empedocles, as is the return of all things to their primal, undifferentiated state. And the allusion to the protoplasm is a sure indication of the primitivist nature of the Boehmer's discourse in Cromie's book. And as fellow readers of Lawrence, I see some of you in the audience, I hope you will do me the credit of accepting that there's a continuity here, from Empedocles to early extinction sci-fi, to Lawrence and his repeated allusions to the shimmering protoplasm of life, and on to William Golding. The very structure of geological history imposes it as a necessity that any world, civilization, or species go through extinction. And this, as you said yourself, Allan, carries great fears and hopes combined. These hopes and fears are most vividly put in The Crown, a 1914 essay penned by Lawrence for his own little magazine, The Signature, about the finite nature of civilization. And I quote from The Crown, "Life is a traveling to the edge of knowledge and then a leap taken. We cannot know beforehand." If one chooses to view the Inheritors, as we were invited to do today, as a dramatization of evolutionary rather than cosmic or geological time, it is tempting to try to flesh out the nature of the evolutionary thinking here. Is the Inheritors about Darwinian natural selection and the survival of the fittest? There's no doubt that it is, but readers of Golding's novel agree, as you said yourself, Allan, that the winning species, the sapiens, is rather vile, while the losing species, conversely, is rather charming in its prelapsarian near immanence. The Neanderthals are described as perfectly fitted to their environment, with an intelligence of the instinct that should have guaranteed their perennity. Their tragic fate is that of unnatural selection. There's something about the Homo sapiens enemy that is clearly Faustian and reeks of hubris and disaster. It is quite clear that evolution has taken the wrong turn here. And in a sense, this is one more nail in the coffin of early evolutionary biology and its idealistic meliorism. Let me quote another passage from The Crown in support of the idea to which I arrived reading you, Allan, that Lawrence and Golding, after him, stood on the shoulders of giants they were all the while trying to topple. And I quote from The Crown again. These laws, which science has invented, like conservation of energy, indestructibility of matter, gravitation, the will to live, survival of the fittest, they are all prison walls, unless we realize that we don't know what they mean. Our will to live contains a germ of suicide, and our survival of the fittest, the germ of degeneracy. This is a complicated essay, but it's a very good example of what Golding called Lawrence's mantic and inspired writing. But I regret to say, it's not very far from Max Nordau in its references to degeneracy, perhaps. It is, though, about something that Golding also dramatized, the limits of sapiens in Homo sapiens. The intellectual dead end and the degradation of the spirit, which other critics, famously Paul Valéry, but countless others too, saw as characteristic of wartime culture, would only clear up in an act of acceptance that the sapiens race, as they knew it, was finished. As we have seen, Lawrence phrases it in terms of a leap into the unknown. I would like, as a closing remark, to dwell on this idea of the leap into the unknown for a minute. The idea of the leap, ultimately, the leap of faith, the Sapphic leap over the cliff, the leap of Empedocles into the crater of Mount Etna, is in a way what ties together the diverse questions that seem to have presided over the making of the Inheritors. First of all, there's the apparent aporia between those who contended with Einstein in 1939 that nuclear powers must keep up with one another at the cost of endless escalation, and those who said right away, like Russell, that there must be immediate and permanent disarmament. If it was to survive, mankind was suddenly faced with the necessity of developing a collective superego of epic stature, of mutating, so to speak. Secondly, the leap, like that perhaps that first takes Locke and Farr across the much feared water in an effort to retrieve missing children who were not even their own, mind you, but those are other members of the herd. The leap is, of course, an evolutionary one. Survival measures units of time, our speaker said earlier. So it does. And by implication, it shows that time is discontinuous. There are leaps in evolutionary cause and effect. Perhaps you remember the Leibnizian phrase, natura non facit saltum. Like many other tales of extinction, some of which are currently ongoing, The Inheritors dramatizes the idea that nature does in fact proceed in leaps, an idea that Hugo de Vries popularized through his theory of mutation in the early years of the 20th century. Rather than cyclical, then, I contend that to Lawrence and Golding, time is rhythmic. It is punctuated by catastrophes and serendipitous mutations over which human sapiens, sadly, has no control. Such is, one might venture to say, the experience of which we, readers of Golding, and all listeners of Professor Hepburn today, are the inheritors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noëlle, because I'm sure Allan will want to react to your remarks before anyone can ask questions. But there is so much in your response that will lead into a lot of discussions, simply because it so contradicts preconceived ideas, or let's say stabilized notions we have about temporality, about evolution, and so on. So first, I'll let Allan respond if he wishes to, and then we'll talk.
Thank you so much. That was a very provocative response, and I learned a lot from it. Things that I hadn't really been thinking about necessarily in preparing the talk. Just first, a couple of things that come to mind on the D.H. Lawrence question, which I find fascinating. The way that Lawrence has been eclipsed from accounts of later modernism, I think needs to be corrected. And I think Golding is one place that we can start to think about that correction. I was reading not long ago Walter Allan's book called The English Novel, which came out in 1954, 56, something like that. And he concludes in the final chapter that D.H. Lawrence and James Joyce are the great modernist writers. And if we forget that was how Lawrence was viewed in the 1950s, leading up to the reversal of the ban on Lady Chatterley's Lover, the reversal of the censorship judgment, then we forget something really essential about how Lawrence was accepted and thought about in the 1940s and 50s. He really was the modernist writer people kept referring to. Bowen, for instance, thought he was the model that she ought to follow. And I think that you can see in The Inheritors, like the scene where Tuomi and the woman whose name I'm forgetting right at the moment have sex under the tree while Locke and Faw are up in the tree above them is something. The violence of the sexual act of those two characters is right out of Lawrence. I think an idea of sexuality as somehow inherently violent was what people thought about in the 1950s. Just as a little footnote, I love the Ted Hughes essay, which was part of a collection of works that was published in honor of Golding's 75th birthday. Just it's worth noting that Hughes gave eulogy at Golding's funeral in 1993, so they remained quite close friends, and they were in conversation about certain aspects of this. Noëlle, I love the idea that you were advancing about leaps and the leaps as temporal leaps, and that we need to account for time in terms of mutation and rhythm and catastrophe, not just as continuity, and how inheritance can also then bypass certain kinds of moments of mutation. That the inheritance, because the title of the novel, Golding's novel, is so ambiguous. What have we inherited? Well, from the Neanderthals, obviously we've inherited a certain kind of genetic structure, as we were saying, but from the cruel and murderous Homo sapiens, we've inherited their cruelty and murderousness. You know, that we have these inheritances that somehow we're supposed to combine and make sense of. So in this, and I think people who read this novel are really perplexed by that sudden switch of narrative perspective in the final two chapters when, as I was pointing out, and as everybody points out when they talk about the Inheritors, we have to judge Locke as the red creature, as this other species, when up to that point we've been thinking of him as our sort of focalized protagonist of this book. You know, it's so disorienting, and to think about even that as a sort of leap that we have to make in terms of our judgment of Locke. It's really fascinating to think about what those leaps might actually leaps across the island, as you rightly pointed out, to save children who are not their own, a certain kind of inheritance of a tribal clan-like anthropology, the leap that we make away from, as well as leaps that we make towards certain kinds of goals. So the leaping away from a Neanderthal collectivity, I think Golding is calling into question. And I'll just close on this because I want to hear what other people have to say. Golding, you should know, just from a biographical point of view, Golding went up to Oxford to train as a scientist. He did 2 years of scientific study before he switched to English for his Oxford degree. His father also was a scientist, and he grew up with sort of scientific explanations in the household. So the Inheritors and the reassessment of science in the Inheritors and in Golding's other works is actually quite a leap away from what he was trained to be and trained as. So he was, he was in this household and in his own training, rebelling against something that was quite meaningful to him up to that time, which is why I concluded on that point about what is human ingenuity and so on. So I would love to hear questions and conversation from others as well.
I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I have questions myself, but I wouldn't want to hold the mic away from anyone. So you know that this has the raise your hand thing, which actually makes you go to the top of my list, and I can see if you want to ask a question. Claire, please. We can't hear you, Claire.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm now on. Thanks ever so much, Allan. It was doubly lovely for me because it took me back to all those wonderful conversations we've had sipping tea together. So that was, it was really moving. And it also, because I'm very new to this novel, which I read knowing you were coming, it also got me thinking onto other common ground that we've worked on. Because of actually, one of the links you made that you were talking about at the end, the first person survival, which has always been so interesting in literature, that Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre says, and we know from the outset that no matter what happens, she'll be okay. But it reminded me of The War of the Worlds, which has exactly the same effect, that when you read the H.G. Wells novel, from the outset, that fictional form and that third person past tense is saying, this is all going to sound absolutely ghastly, but don't worry, I'm still there afterwards. Whereas, of course, the Inheritors denies us that. But this made me start thinking about sound because of the War of the Worlds, obviously the radio play, which is one of those first radio annihilation narratives. And I think Orson Welles makes the Wells novel so much creepier because it deals with the annihilation of sound and how that sort of dawning extinction really feels when you're breathing your last air and the sound is no longer getting through, and exactly what silence radio, that sort of resonance there. And so inevitably, because I know Golding had a really rich radio life, and that, I wonder whether he'd used that, explored that for this particular novel. I can remember listening to a really good adaptation, I think he did, of Freefall, and also Pincher Martin, whereas this one seems to me, even right to that very last quotation you read with that silence of the third person cringing figure, there was something so incredibly radiophonic. So, it was a real question I wanted to ask. Again, are you going there in this particular book, and have you done it with the Inheritors?
No, but as you know, this is close to my heart. The question of the acoustic in the novel and how it functions, especially in the post-war period, I think about it all the time. It is so striking to me that there are a group of characters in this novel who sound like the names for solfege. Fa, it could be do, re, mi, fa, sol. It's fa, lock. They're all, there's something. Golding himself was a very accomplished pianist. He had ambitions to be a pianist, a concert pianist himself. Late in life, he was quite put out by his own performance, where he said, "How is it that I could be playing the piano for 60 years and never really mastered Beethoven?" It's I mean, lots of people ask themselves the same question, but he really thought musically, and I think this novel to me is fascinating, not just because of the solfege kind of content, but the way that the sound, it's communication via sound. The novel is obviously about communication systems, but when Locke addresses the new people for the first time, he says, "Oe, oe." They hear it as a war cry, but he's actually saying, "Hello, hello." Talk to me. And there's that wonderful scene in the ice cave when he hears the echoes. Fa has taken an offering up to try and make Mal cured, and he shouldn't be in that cave and so on. But it's an echo chamber. I do think he thinks radiophonically, as you're suggesting, that the adaptations of the novels that come somewhat later, but he wrote pieces for the radio. He wrote a piece called The Shield of Achilles that was broadcast in the West Country radio, BBC radio service, for instance. I think he does think about acoustic textures and what those communicate, as in music, quite beyond the communication systems of language per se. Obviously, with the telepathy or thought pictures that the Neanderthals share, the kind of primitive language that we understand. And it's very interesting to think about this novel as being read in translation, that you are somehow always translating Neanderthal speech, just as the Neanderthals have to translate the Homo sapiens speech into, it's like, an example would be Liku and Tanakil, or it's like Liku, Tanakil, they're trying to understand what their names are, like what those, you keep reading the novel in those translations and what might actually be said. Fa is the best one at figuring out what's going on, where she hears and translates appropriately. But it's a really interesting question. It's not part of what I'm working on, but obviously, this is the 1950s, this sort of real efflorescence of radio work by British writers in this period, as they working for the BBC, working for overseas British services as well. Golding was, he tried to conserve his energies, but he certainly did get engaged in that as well. I don't know the Free Fall adaptation or the Pincher Martin adaptation. That's fascinating. I'd love to hear them and hear what he does with them. Thank you for that.
Even the talk that you talked about, the writer's dilemma, that was also on the radio, and it was recorded. So yeah. So it was definitely a big theme.
Yes, I didn't know that either. So it migrated from TLS printed. It became a book with an introduction by Stephen Spender, and then on the radio, I'm surprised to hear, but I can see they're short sort of insights into what the writer's dilemma is in the early 1960-61. Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Claire.
I can see that Catherine raised her hand. Catherine? We can't hear you, Catherine.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I think Olivier had put the sign on before me. But that's okay.
Me? No,
Yeah.
I'm letting you speak. No.
Okay. Okay, sorry. So thank you, Noëlle, for the leap of Empedocles. That was really fascinating. And I wanted to ask a question to Allan about the timing of the writing of the novel and this scene of genocide, of archetypal genocide and primal genocide. I was wondering whether this had something to do also with the colonial context or the post-colonial context and the independence of India. I was thinking of the genocide in Tasmania, and is England facing its guilt also?
That's such a great question. If I'll take a roundabout way of answering that, the early critical literature on Golding always assessed his novels as fables. So Lord of the Flies is a fable about good and evil, The Inheritors as a fable about species and so on, as I was suggesting, but they never talked about genocide. They never, I'm talking about 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's only in the 80s, 90s, and later that critics have started to talk about literature of atrocity, that The Inheritors is actually about a genocide, that there's some critical accounts of the Neanderthals as the substitute for Jews, that the description of the red-skinned Neanderthals, their low brows, their prognathous appearance, and so on, as a sort of fable then about genocide and a fable about atrocity coming out of the Second World War. And so I don't know how to explain that it took people so long, 30 years really, to start to come to grips with that sort of historical way of reading Golding. And I think you're right, say whether it's genocide in the Second World War or genocide subsequently, why people were resistant to that, even while they wanted to recognize that Golding was a fable writer. It seems to be disconnected somehow, that recognition from what the fable might actually be about. Because I should say this too. Golding was understood from Lord of the Flies and this novel to be a science fiction writer. That's how he was read in the 1950s. He wasn't read as anything else. He wasn't read as a realist novelist. He was read as a science fiction novelist. There was a short book that he did with John Wyndham, whom I mentioned in my talk, the science fiction writer. There were 3 people who contributed to a short volume called Sometime Never, or something like that. But Golding was, I think he was excluded from the discussion of genocide and literature of atrocity because he was understood to be a science fiction writer. It was detached from reality. It was detached from history. It was purely in the fabulist position. But that being said, I do think, I was touching on this. It's a question of the Anthropocene. It's a question of human-dominated speciesism and landscapes and so on. Like there's something quite actively active in the fable format that he is trying to get at, that there's an abiding cruelty in humankind, and this is how it manifests itself. Does that sort of answer your question, or?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Catherine, you took my question, but you formulated it in your own personal way. I was thinking about empire and the colonial wars and how that reality was being addressed maybe through the novel. But as you were talking about fables, I was constantly thinking about allegory and the fact that there could be multiple applications to a single storyline, so that the trick in Golding's writing would be to address a variety of problems and issues rather than channel all of the the meaning into one specific question. I was wondering if that was an acceptable. I don't know much about Goldring. I'm out of my depth here, but would that be an acceptable hypothesis? And the other thing, more like a footnote, reading him as a science fiction writer is the same as reading, for instance, Mark Twain as children's literature. It's a way of diffusing whatever import the texts might have beyond entertainment. Or so are you dealing with these issues as well in your book?
I'm trying to avoid a little bit the discussion of fable, though. I think your point is absolutely right, that the fable allows us to read allegorically, if you will. So he wrote a rebuttal to some of these literary critical pieces about him as a fabulist. He gave a talk at UCLA in the early 1960s about fables. It's collected in his collection of essays called The Hot Gates. And he's, so I think it was a way for him to limit some of the more far out, if I could use that 60s expression, interpretations of his books. That he was trying to put some controls on exactly what people were saying about his work. So, but I completely endorse what you and Catherine asked about the imperialist and colonialist context of, it's obviously about a kind of indigenous population, as it were, versus a migratory population of Homo sapiens, the Inheritors is, and the stigmatization by race, obviously, with the Neanderthals. I completely buy that. So in Fable, the essay, Golding actually reads the Swiss Family Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels as fables. So you mentioned, the sort of the tradition of reading Mark Twain as children's literature, reading fables. La Fontaine is a good example of this in French, obviously, where it's like if you read it for the surface meaning, you're missing most of the meaning, the political meaning, and I think the same is true for him. It's that he wants to extract something that is essential about narrative or about humankind and renders that as fabulous. So I think that there's a great latitude in the way that we understand fable, moral fable, allegorical fable. And, he clearly knows this, like Gulliver's Travels as how you play with scale in Gulliver's Travels, how you play with episodes, how you focalize experience, and how you have human-animal interaction. So I was thinking about this a lot, actually. This is the part that really does interest me. The way that the fable tradition works through the 20th century. So if you think about something like Wind in the Willows, to take an example of children's literature, as a sort, you could read that fabulistically because it's about animals behaving as human beings. But if other fables from this moment, Animal Farm, he talks about directly in his essay on fables. So Animal Farm is 1944, I believe, the George Orwell fable. But Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is 1960, begins with that fable. Imagine a world where no birds are singing. Imagine what this kind of world would be like. So I think there's a fabulistic moment in culture as well in the 40s and 50s as a way of accessing what we were talking about with Catherine, the literature of atrocity, the literature of genocide, the literature of colonialism, that there was a casting of this as fable. You see it also in somebody like Patrick White, the Australian writer. So I think we need to have a lot of latitude in our way of reading the fable when we talk about Golding as a fabulist. Does that answer the question a little bit, Hélène?
It definitely does, and it makes me think more about detoured ways of approaching that's the unspeakable, or what is perceived as unspeakable at the moment of writing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thank
Yeah.
you very much, Allan. Are there raised hand? I can see Jennifer's hand.
Yeah, this is a somewhat naive question, but I was thinking, as you mentioned, that no language is not a sign of idiocy. The Neanderthals can share thought pictures. I was thinking about Ezra Pound's ideograms, and I was wondering if there was any relationship there, if Golding, might be thinking about Pound in any way. Probably not, but I thought I'd ask.
No, it's worth thinking about. It's worth, if I could just broaden the question a little bit to Golding as poet. I don't have any evidence of him reading Pound. He definitely read T.S. Eliot, who's one of whose books I see over your shoulder there on your shelf. And you should also know that Golding's first publication was a book of poems. So he thought of himself, as many people do in their early writing career, thought of himself as a poet and thought of himself as I squirm to say that he was a modernist poet. I think his poetic sensibility tended to be more Walter de la Mare, 19th century rhyming poems. But I like that idea of the Poundian ideogram as a way of like, what is, again, I mentioned this earlier, but what's translatable? What moves from one language to another or from one medium to another. So the visual to the verbal. I find it really fascinating in the novel because Locke often is at a loss for words and he acts things out. Like he'll act out a story, like I was walking along, and he'll actually do the physical gestures in order to make people understand what it was. In addition to or he'll be at an utter loss about how to explain certain things. He doesn't have a thought picture for what happens or what he's feeling. So there is something in that about the inexplicable or the unspeakable, to use that word that we had going earlier. It's like, how do these things translate in and out of different performance or speech or telepathy, whatever it might be. And it's, I actually think we kind of touched on this, and it's not your question per se, but there's something really in Golding's representation of artists. I think that there's something about artists that he finds despicable. He thinks that artists are, how shall I say, like Tuomi. He's cruel, murderous, plotting, scheming. He draws the representations that he draws of the stag on the ground or on the rock. They're falsehoods. It's back to that problem of, the artist is a liar in some ways. And, Golding is suspicious about the making of representations as a replacement for reality. So it might be a different way of addressing the Poundian ideogram.
Thanks.
Sorry, I'm taking notes. Because this is really, really interesting. I was also wondering at some point in your in your talk about the relationship between Golding's approach to species and the scientific research that was taking place at the time, related to genetics, and so I'm not sure about the timing here, but I seem to remember that in the 1950s, talk was happening around these questions, and finding out exactly what was human in human beings. So do you have any substantial information that would lead us to think about this?
No, I don't have substantial information. I like you, I have some hunches about it. So like the discovery of DNA, for instance, at Oxford in 1950? It's around this time.
It's around this time, yeah.
1954 is sort of what I have in mind, but I could be wrong about that. I think that he was quite keen on archaeology, on digging things up, was more the direction. So like, what does it mean to bring things out of the earth? And that Mal goes into the earth. The hyenas nearly unbury him and eat him, Mal's body, I mean. They cover him back up and put a stone upon that. And, there's that digging scene where Mal and the women actually start digging the earth to bury Mal in the first instance. And it's this kind of archaeological moment in the novel. And it's like, how do you deduce ideas about time and extinction and so on from the disappearance of species that come out of the earth? I was reading, and it's a different thing, and it's quite popular, but it was very worth reading. I read Elizabeth Colbert's book called The Extinction of Species, is that what it's called? A series of books, essays, pardon me, that came out in the New Yorker, and that she put together as a book. It came out maybe 10 years ago, something like that. Excellent book about how every time human beings enter any kind of environment, they drive other species to extinction, beginning with the large mammals. So she gives examples of, and not only the large mammals, but she gives the example of New Zealand, if we can go back to Tasmania and that part of the world, where all of these emu species were driven to extinction. There were several emu species on the island of Tasmania, and all of them disappeared within 200 years. And she makes this point that extinction is actually, what we don't notice about extinction is that it happens gradually. That we tend not to see it because, the emu disappears or the whale disappears, but there are other whales, and it happens over a period of 200 years, and that knowledge isn't transmitted from one generation to the next. Because currently we are seeing such an acceleration in the extinction of species around the world. Amphibians are massively endangered by human activity, human manipulation of environments, and climate change. The number of frog species is disappearing at an alarming rate. We're actually thinking about extinction on a different time scale now. But I think that to come back to your question, he was probably thinking about genetics, but I think Golding was much more interested in archaeology and excavation as the scientific orientation of this book. Yeah.
They're not radically contradictory.
No, not at all.
But I understand. Well, the archaeology paradigm puts him more in line with the modernists and the general, let's say, trend of thinking about recovering the true nature of man, if we want to go quickly about it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, this was accelerated by, say, the Piltdown Man episode in the 1920s. You have another example of this in Angus Wilson's novel called Anglo-Saxon Attitudes from 1957, which is about archaeology also in England. We understand the setting of the Inheritors to be England, or that's how it's often interpreted, as a sort of, let's say, indigenous English landscape, before nation exists, and so on. I think that there is a kind of continuity that you're suggesting about modernist excavation, or even if you think about Schliemann in the 19th century and the excavation forward from Troy, or Arthur Evans excavating on the island of Crete and Knossos and so on. That's in the 1920s and through the 1920s. So there's something about a longer time scale that Golding is interested in, not quite so specific as Schliemann or Arthur Evans or what have you. It's a really interesting question, I think.
And also the idea of doing archaeology on site in Britain rather than in those exotic places around the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So bringing home all of this possibility of ancient civilization.
Quite so. He has an essay on archaeology called Digging, and it's about Stonehenge and Druidic archaeology. Yeah, exactly.
I can see that Caroline has raised her hand. Caroline?
Thank you so much, Allan. So yeah, I have several questions, but yes, it was fascinating, and thank you, Noëlle, well, for this fabulous response. Apparently, Conrad wrote co-wrote a novel called The Inheritors, so which I haven't read, but I was just wondering whether Golding was self-consciously engaging with Conrad. And also reading the very last sentences of The Inheritors, I was struck with the resonances with Heart of Darkness.
Yes.
Golding repeats the phrase "line of darkness."
Yes.
Mentions ivory, and yes. Well, you already said that the novel was anti-colonial, and I was initially wondering whether atomic policies intersected at all with the global question of colonization, whether those two political matters intersected.
That's a very good question. That's a very insightful question. So on the question of Conrad, I have read The Inheritors, which is a novel co-written between Ford Madox Ford and Joseph Conrad. It's not something I would wish upon many people. It's not a very good novel. I don't think he was thinking about it. The Inheritors, that novel was sort of rediscovered it was republished in the 1980s, for instance. It sort of fell out of favor. But I do think that you're quite right about the allusions to the Heart of Darkness at the end of The Inheritors. The question about anti-colonial and nuclear policy in the 1950s, they're synchronous problems, and yet they seem to be diametrically opposed in some ways, don't they? You know, it's like the decolonization that's happening during the under France around the world, and under Britain around the world in the 1940s and 50s, seems to be at odds with the sort of materialization of security superpowers. And is there a way of making those two things come together in a more intelligible fashion? I'm not sure I have the answer to that. It's something I would like to think a lot about before I give you an answer, but I will tuck it away. And yeah, very good question. Very good question.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Allan. And I do have another question. If
would you mind?
By all means, yes.
May I take just two minutes and get a glass of water, because I'll be right back. It's right next door, but I just need 2 minutes. Okay.
Yeah, it's 2 hours. It's
yeah. It makes me look at the clock and realize that we've almost run out of time.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, run home, Amy. We'll talk later.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye. I really enjoyed it.
Amy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Jennifer, I thought you had a question. Where's it gone?
Yeah, just a brief one.
Okay, so let's not forget, Jennifer has a question.
Just raise your hand again, Jennifer, if you may.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so that I can. I was wondering, Claire, is this a new question, or?
No,
Yes.
did I forget to take my hand down?
That's not a problem.
No,
just
sorry.
Just to make sure, because we're slowly going to wrap up, and I wanted to make sure no one
you have to
left
think
with
of me having
unasked
sat there.
and unanswered questions.
No, I was sitting there for the last half hour with my hand in the air. Yeah, no, I can.
Take all the exercise you can get.
Yes, I'll have to do some editing to this video, right?
Oh no.
This is fine. My son can help me. He's very good at this. Is it okay, Jennifer, since we're here, will you make Noëlle maybe I'll ask you to make the announcement about modernist objects, and Jennifer about Caroline Levine when we're done.
Sorry.
So, Allan, I think Caroline had another question, in fact.
And in fact, I have a
And
better
we're
answer.
almost done. We're
No, it's
thinking
fine.
about letting you
But
go
I mean,
because it's a
No, it's
trap
fine.
after a while.
So I was thinking, actually, there's something very interesting about the idea of nuclear testing that happens in these remote places, isn't there?
that's what
You know, we talk atoll. I think this is part of your question, that these first world powers, most of them on the Security Council, such as the UK, France, the USSR, and the United States, all decide to explode bombs, but they tend to do it in the South Pacific. They do it on an island off of Australia. They do it not in their own backyard, but in some remote place. So it's like, we have every right to do this because, we are colonial powers. And it's a kind of complete indifference to what's going on in other parts of the world in this moment. The peak of nuclear testing was in 1961. When so there, and between 1945 and 1961, as a sort of arc of decolonization and nuclear testing at the same time, and they are synchronous processes, and I think that they're antithetical to each other, where the decolonialization of empires is at odds with the almost desperate clinging of power by the UK. So, like the humiliation of Suez in 1956, or these ideas of Britain losing its prestige and trying to find some third role for itself between the superpowers and so on. If we think just of the British example, it's such a good question. It's really, I'll think about it more. In addition to Noëlle's excellent comments about these matters in her introductory comments too.
Although the US did do it in their own backyard, right? I'm not sure. I'm sure you won't see it, but there are those amazing pictures from the Las Vegas Bureau, where you see people around the pool in Vegas having fun. And there's this puff of the nuclear cloud right there in the sky in the background. Those are extremely striking. And I think perhaps they point at something else that to me is in the Inheritors, which is the capability of one to distance oneself even from what is close, so as to perform whatever violence or crime is deemed necessary. And in this case, the people going to Vegas, tourists, are expendable.
Yes.
And in a similar way, perhaps, to the way the Neanderthals are expendable, so as to procure the advent of some other race, supposedly superior.
And isn't one of the implications of the ending that as the Homo sapiens move on, they're going to exterminate other clans and other people, so that they're not done with their massacres? And yeah, and I take the point about testing at Los Alamos or in Las Vegas and so on. I also want it's just at the back of my mind, but nuclear testing that was underwater in this period. So nuclear testing where you would detonate underwater as a way of mitigating, they thought, the radioactive fallout. Yeah. Caroline, you had another question?
Sorry. Yes, well, you mentioned Dimmock at the beginning, and so I was reminded of her latest book, Weak Planet, which extends her commitment to weak theory. And she defends a focus on genre and the part played by genre in giving shape to survival, to narratives of survival. And I was wondering whether genre plays an important part in your reflection or in your project. And also, I noticed you didn't mention the word dystopia. So was it is it deliberate, or are you thinking out of the genre of dystopia?
I think this attaches a little bit to Claire's question about H.G. Wells and so on, and the War of the Worlds, which I didn't really address. But and yes, it is dystopic fiction insofar as a lot of these novels imagine alternative states that are dystopic. They imagine states that have somehow, or they try to imagine alternative states. So one of the things that I'm arguing in this book is the reactions to the welfare state in the UK. Between 1945 and 1960, approximately, were legion. Everybody wanted to think about the state in this period because they didn't like the imposition of the welfare state and its measures. A lot of UK authors move abroad. Graham Greene moves to Switzerland and then to Nice. Elizabeth Bowen moves to Ireland. James Bond author Ian Fleming moves to Jamaica. They all move offshore because they're trying to escape taxation in the UK. So our creative writers are thinking about alternative states. So they tend not necessarily to fall into a spectrum of utopia, dystopia. They tend to fall more into a much broader spectrum, I would say. Military dictatorships and autocratic states, and a lot of them are futuristic states. A good example of this would be the John Wyndham novel called The Kraken. The Kraken Wakes is an example of climate change and how the state has to reorganize itself in light of changes and so on. So I do, there are certainly dystopic novels in this instance. They tend to be catastrophic. Ape in Essence by Aldous Huxley, which I mentioned in my talk, would be a good example of this. Yeah, and then you have disappearing states, weak states, failed states, colonial states, as we were talking about, and there's quite a range of this. But the dystopic is almost always there. It's not necessarily the dominant current. Yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Maybe one last question from Jennifer.
Oh, this is a short one, and maybe again a little bit off. But I was wondering if you might see David Jones as closer than Pound in relationship to Golding, and with the archaeological aspect you had mentioned in Britain.
Yes, and also I would think the religious aspect as well. David Jones's religious concerns, and Golding is almost always, certainly in the early criticism of him, treated as a religious thinker. So in that sense, correlates with David Jones and a lot of the other people who are writing in this period. Hélène mentioned this at the beginning, but my last book was about faith in Britain in the mid-century, manifestations of cultural faith. So I think that Golding is certainly part and parcel of that particular cultural formation, as David Jones would be as well. Yeah, lots of examples. David Jones is not somebody I know particularly well, so more specificity to your question I can't offer right at the moment. Yeah. I just would like to say, because I didn't really address it on Claire's question, I should point out that just as Lord of the Flies is a revision of Ballantyne's The Coral Island from 1858, with the same characters, Ralph and so on, The Inheritors is a rewriting of H.G. Wells's The Grizzly Folk. So he had a direct Wells intertext that he was dealing with. A lot of people have already talked about this, so I do not, but a direct engagement with a modernist text in that case. And I think Claire's question also was touching on, the War of the Worlds and so on, but we need to account for that modernist continuity of narratives about the future. Thinking about the future and thinking about the catastrophic future from the War of the Worlds through to the post-war period. It's how the future was conceived. I think Noëlle mentioned that she felt more comfortable with futurist thinking, but how we account for modernist futures reaches a certain kind of thinking about extinction in the 1950s with this novel and similar novels. So. I don't know, by the way, Caroline, I don't know Weak Planet. I haven't read it yet, so thank you for that tip.
Well, thank you very much, Allan, for the wonderful talk, and also the questions, your answers to all our questions, and for being a wonderful colleague to work with towards this seminar. It was all a bit chaotic, and you were a very good sport. So thank you so much. Thank you, Noëlle, for the response. It was absolutely wonderful and triggered all the questions we had in the further conversation.